Johanna, this is the first time you've been here at the UN for these treaty talks. You look out at all those countries there, these rogue governments who think they know what's best for us when it comes to our firearm freedoms. What's your reaction to what you've watched in there the past week?
I'm flabbergasted, honestly. I mean, I look out, first of all, it's like watching paint dry. Every country seems to be saying virtually the same thing, but what it really comes down to is they're all very concerned about sovereignty of each individual member state, and they make no distinction between the sovereignty of, say, Venezuela and the United States. And then they make a special note of the importance of preserving the right of each member state to protect itself. No mention of the individual right of protection. So to me, that's incredibly dangerous and perverse to everything that I know and have grown up with in the United States.
And so true. Today you have Syria talking about how this treaty is about transparency. It's about peace. They mention the state and the right of self-defense. You look at what's going on in Syria right now. What do those people need but an ability to defend themselves, and they will never have it under this.
Exactly. I think if those people had a chance to speak, I think they would agree. They would say that what we need is the ability to protect ourselves. I mean, history is very clear on that fact, that as soon as you disarm the people, that's when the government can become tyrannous. We've seen it over and over and over again.
The United States last week decided not to speak, and instead they handed out a statement. And in it, the administration is saying, when it comes to our Second Amendment rights, they will not be handicapped in any way. Handicapped? What does that say?
I don't know what that means. I've never heard the term handicap in connection with the Second Amendment. I think that the importance when we look at what people are saying about the protection of the Second Amendment is who is speaking the words. What does the Second Amendment mean to that individual? And I think depending on who is speaking, will have an impact on what it means when they say it will not impact the Second Amendment.
But when they say handicap, they
Right.
don't say our rights are not in any way going to be compromised. Our rights in no way are a bargaining chip. You don't hear those
Right,
words.
right.
It's almost like they're leaving the door open for whatever happens behind closed doors.
And they will. I mean, there's really no repercussions that I can see anyway. I mean, and it will happen very slowly over time.
And then you have Iran, and you pointed this out to me in that paper. You know, they're appointed to a group. They just were, you know, the UN just said they violated by their rights in the sense of a state by selling illegally guns to Syria. And yet you have Iran saying, you know what, we don't think missiles should
Right.
be in that treaty. I mean, what does that say about where this treaty is going to go and what's it going
Right.
to accomplish?
Well, I mean, nothing. It won't accomplish anything. I think the ability for it to accomplish anything is going to be impaired by the all-encompassing language that it's using. There's no distinction between illicit trade and legal and valid trade. There's no distinction at all. So I see that to mean that if there's no distinction, then what we have is an underlying assumption, I guess, that trade should be completely eliminated. But that's not true because, again, we go back to the right of the individual state to protect itself. So then we leave firearm trade, weapons trade in the hands of the governments. And again, that's very scary. And when we see Iran making a statement that missiles should not be included, I mean, that's just laughable. I mean, that validates all the presumptions that most of us have about what the UN stands for.
You're going to be speaking here as an NGO. You represent the Fair Trade Group. What is the message you want to deliver to that body of people sitting there?
I think that for the trade, we have to be very cautious in terms of how a treaty like this or other efforts by the UN will have on international trade. I think that it will be death by 1,000 lashes. We've already seen it with the current administration. Bit by bit, they impede the ability to freely engage in trade, lawful and legitimate trade in firearms and ammunition. I think this will just be one more tool for that to be accomplished, and at the end of the day, if there's enough lashes that will impact the ability of individuals to obtain firearms, either it will become cost prohibitive or they just won't be available because companies will elect not to engage in the business.
But you have France saying the legal trade and the illegal trade, in their minds, they're inseparable.
Right. Right.
And that's a dangerous way to go.
That's a very dangerous way to go. I mean, there should be a recognition of what is lawful and legitimate and needed trade. And so far, I've heard only just a few member states make that distinction. Even the United States, from what I can tell, they use flowery words, but they have nothing of substance to back up what they're saying. So with the failure to distinguish between the illegal and the legal, then the legal will definitely be impacted, and it may be slow, but eventually it will just squeeze out companies and businesses from engaging in this type of trade.
And what sounds like important to you guys in the trade side of things, the industry, is the same thing I think that the NRA and people like John Bolton pushed for years ago. Define what you mean by a small arm.
Right, exactly. There's no definition. They keep saying small arms and light weapons. I have no idea. I mean, does that include 22 calibers? That's ridiculous if it does. The failure to define that just will make it so broad as to be completely ineffective.
And that's the words we hear: broad and robust.
Right, right.
Got to ask you, is representing the Fair Trade Group, does the industry have the same concerns as groups like the NRA when it comes to the Second Amendment?
I think we do. Our approach, though, is that the negative impacts on trade will impact the Second Amendment.
In other words, the harder they make for firearms to be sold or made, the tougher it is to own one.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, it's economics 101, really. The more regulatory restrictions that are put in place, and that's exactly the type of structure that's envisaged by the ATT. What that will do is that will restrict, that will slow down, that will impede lawful trade, either because of record-keeping requirements, prior approvals, prior documentation to justify a transfer or an international transaction. And so what will happen is fewer and fewer companies will engage in that business. The governments, though, will always be able to engage in that business.
You know, I always say every American, and you're experiencing it for the first time, should go inside that building and just see how the UN functions and what they're paying for.
Absolutely.
And what's at stake if we let them get away with what they want to get away with when it comes to America.
No, I couldn't agree more, because this is a room, so far, I think I've heard every country say pretty much the same thing with little tweaks here and there. But the underlying message is that it has to be all-encompassing, the highest possible standard, legally binding,
no
distinction. To me, those are very, very strong words. The U.S. delegation has said, well, our intent is to have the rest of the world come up to the level of the United States. I think if you talk to any business or any individual engaged in either importing or exporting weapons or firearms or weapons of bigger power, they will all say it is incredibly restrictive. And the marketplace is not open to everyone because it takes time, money, and understanding to be able to engage in it. So if that's the standard, then I think that's a loaded statement.
I call it UN speak, but we listen to
it
and sitting there. But if you had to put your money on it right now, the way things are going, breaking off into committees, would you say we're going to have a treaty at the end of July?
I think it's really possible. I mean, I think that a lot hinges on this definition of what consensus is, but I think a lot of countries now are moving for a simple majority to pass the ATT. If that happens, the U.S. is outnumbered. If it even votes against it, I haven't really heard anything that brings comfort to my mind on that fact, in which case we will have an ATT, and then it will be up to Congress as to whether it ratifies it. But regardless of what happens in the United States, we're still going to have countries throughout the rest of the world putting on their restrictions for any kind of trade with U.S. companies, and that in and of itself will affect trade.